Welcome to part 5 in our Bread of Life series that is carrying us through the Lenten season. I hope that you have been enjoying this series, and we've already tackled a lot thus far. We started off in episode 1 just talking about the significance of bread, but not just bread, but bread in connection to Jesus. And in John 6:35, Jesus makes this declaration that I am the bread of life. And so we talked about how we were going to look at stories connected to Jesus and bread. So in episode 2, or part 2, we talked about the feeding of the 5,000. In part 3, the feeding of the 4,000. And then in last week's episode, we put that all together with the yeast of the Pharisees and talked about what Jesus was doing with his mission and just the proclamations he was making. And for this episode, I want to go back to the feeding of the 5,000. And I want to look at what John does with this story, because what we find in John chapter 6, where we're going to camp out for this episode and part of the next episode, is that John gives us new information that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not give us in their telling of the feeding of the 5,000. And this isn't surprising by any stretch of the imagination, because if you know anything about these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call the synoptics because it's a word that means to view alongside of one another because they're so similar in content. John is 90% new material. And one of the main reasons for that is that John was written later than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so John doesn't have to rehash what they have already done. And in many cases, John gives us an expanded view of a particular story. And that's precisely what happens here in John chapter 6, because he gives us the feeding of the 5,000, which is very similar in length to Matthew, Mark, and Luke's. But what happens is that after Jesus then walks on water, we get Jesus in Capernaum, and now he's talking about the significance of that episode of the feeding of the 5,000, which would have been plus women and children, so maybe 9,000 or 10,000 people. And so in John chapter 6, and you can read this on your own time, how John tells the story of the feeding of the 5,000, there are 3 key anchor points that I just want to highlight. The first is in verse 3, where John tells us the Jewish Passover festival was near. Now, this is the most anticipated and celebrated festival of the entire year for the Jewish people. It recalls how God rescued and redeemed them from their slavery in Egypt. And because Rome is now ruling the world and Israel is under the boot of Rome, they come together in Jerusalem for this festival to also anticipate and plead with God to bring about a new exodus, to get rid of those Romans. And so Jesus has the feeding of the 5,000 plus women and children. And then in verse 14, it says, the people's response is, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Now, the prophet here is a reference back to Deuteronomy 18:15, when Moses states, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. So Moses, right before he dies, makes forth this prophecy that there's going to be a prophet like him. And then 3 verses later in Deuteronomy 18, God affirms that this is what God is going to do. And so because Moses led the first Exodus, which came about with the 10th sign or the plague, which was the Passover, the people come together for Passover to recall the Exodus story and how Moses led them out of Egypt. And they also come anticipating this second Moses who will lead a new Exodus. And they believe that this is Jesus. This is the reference to the prophet. And this is why in the very next verse in John 6, verse 15, it says they intended to come and make Jesus king by force. So their Messiah, the prophet, the coming king, this is all the same person, In the consciousness of the Jewish people, this is someone who, among many things, would be a successful military leader who would fight a decisive battle against Rome, and they want Jesus to be that. They believe Jesus is that. And he's just taken a little bit of bread and multiplied it for thousands of people. That's a really good thing for a military commander to do when the army is low on food and is hungry. Jesus has been going around healing people. That's a really good thing to have if your military commander can heal people, particularly those who have been injured on the field of battle. Or Jesus is also raising people from the dead. Now that's even better yet. You walk through the battlefield and it's like, you get up, get back at it. Right? It's like you have unlimited supply of soldiers to take out the foreign, pagan, oppressive empire of Rome. They want Jesus to be that. And it's the feeding of the 5,000 that, at least in John, that's tipping the people off to, we got to make him king by force. And Jesus retreats. He is not going to be made king by force that way. That's not the kingdom he is trying to lead. And Jesus retreats. He then walks on water in John chapter 6. The disciples and Jesus at the end of the night, or actually in the morning, end up over here, and then they go and they walk to Capernaum. And this is where our story picks up. It's in the synagogue in Capernaum. And so Capernaum, here on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, here is an aerial view of the archaeological site today. It's a stunning location. Jesus knew how to pick a place. Here is the synagogue, and this synagogue is almost certainly atop of the synagogue that Jesus would have done this teaching in. If you go into the synagogue, here's the view from inside the synagogue today. And again, the synagogue Jesus taught from, or taught in, would have been probably right underneath this one. There's a foundation that dates to the time of Jesus. And so this is where our story picks up. So verse 25, it says, when they found him on the other side of the lake, and by the way, it's later on in John 6, we find that's in the Capernaum synagogue. They asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Jesus answered, very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you, for on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval. Then they asked him, what must we do to do the works God requires? Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. So they asked him, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. So the people here reference a story that happens in the Sinai desert after God rescues and redeems them from their slavery in Egypt through Passover, through the Exodus. And they get out into the desert and they are hungry. And you can read this in Exodus chapter 16. 8 times we are told the people grumbled, or the word grumbled is used. And then once they've been done grumbling, or in the midst of their grumbling, God gives them manna, this bread-like substance that they eat for the 40 years that they're in the desert. So the people reference this story about bread in the desert. But it begins while they're in the synagogue by saying, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? And you go, what sign, Jesus, are you going to do? You go, were they not just at the feeding of the 5,000 the day before? Well, the answer is yes and no. Some were at the feeding of the 5,000, but what we find just before we start reading, this part of the narrative is that there are other people that have joined because they heard of what Jesus had done the previous day. And so those who were not there are not questioning whether or not it happened. It's like collectively the people are saying, yeah, we were there for that. We saw that sign, but what sign are you going to do now? And you go, why are they asking this? Well, there was an understanding in the first century world among the Jewish people that when the Messiah comes, he will reenact the manna miracle. In fact, here is a passage from the latter part of the 1st century AD from a Jewish text called 2 Baruch 29:8, in which it says, "The treasury of manna shall again descend from on high, and they will eat of it in those years," talking about the Messianic era. And so what's really going on here is this comparison between Moses and Jesus, because Moses led the Israelites. He's the one that made the proclamation. They're looking for a second prophet or a second Moses to lead a new Exodus. And so they're going, okay, Moses fed a nation. Jesus, you fed roughly 10,000 people. Moses did this for 40 years. Jesus has only done this once. There is no feeding of the 4,000. That comes later on. Moses did this using what they called heavenly bread. It's even referenced here in what we just read. Jesus used ordinary bread. This is the comparison. This is why they're saying, what sign will you give? And so Jesus continues and he says, hold up here. "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven." So Jesus is saying, hold on. This was not Moses who gave you this bread. God actually gave you this bread through Moses. It came from God, and God is giving you bread from heaven again. Verse 33, "For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." "Sir," they said, "always give us this bread." Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life." There's our passage we've been centering ourselves around. Jesus continues, "Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me, and still you do not believe. All those the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never drive away, for I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of those he has given me, but raise them up at the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day." Jesus goes, I am what you are looking for. I am the one who provides for you. I am that bread of life. And how do they respond? Because he's just said, you still don't believe me. Verse 41, "At this the Jews there began to grumble about him, because he said, I am the bread of life that came down from heaven. They said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, I came down from heaven? Stop grumbling among yourselves," Jesus answered. And then he goes on to affirm again that he is the bread of life. And you go, how do they respond to what Jesus is saying in the synagogue? It's the same story all over again. Is that just as the bread from heaven, the bread from God, came down in Exodus 16, it was in the midst of the Israelites grumbling. Now Jesus says, I am the bread that has come down from heaven, and now the people are grumbling all over again. And why are they grumbling? Because Jesus isn't meeting their expectation. They have a certain understanding about what the prophet, the Messiah, the coming king is supposed to do. And Jesus, although in part is fitting what they expected with the feeding and all that, they're now saying, give us more to prove who you say you are. And Jesus goes, don't worry about the bread. This is about something so much bigger than bread. I am the gift to the world. I am the bread of life that has come down, and you're not believing me. And they're grumbling. And the reason why they're grumbling is because Jesus isn't meeting their expectations. In a way, you could say they're having a crisis of faith. And I believe what was true for them is true for us today as well, that the crisis of faith occurs when there's a gap between expectation and reality. And we all get this, don't we? That we have these moments, these pockets in our lives when things happen and we go, that's not what I expected. My reality and my expectation are not in agreement with one another. There is a gap, and when we anticipate or hope or expect that God is going to do something and He doesn't do it, and our reality is very different than our expectation, it is at this point where most often, for many of us, we have this crisis of faith. And I believe that this is a word that just speaks into our story today. That as we are going through this Lenten season, as we've been talking about Jesus being the bread of life, and how we've been talking about how Jesus has been providing for the Jews and how Jesus has been providing for the Gentiles, and Jesus wants to provide for all people, that there's probably been a bit of a subtle narrative going on in some of our heads that are going, yeah, but Jesus really isn't providing for me in the midst of these circumstances. And those circumstances, in many ways, probably feels like a desert that is in our lives. Where again, what we would long for, what we would anticipate, what we would hope for, isn't actually happening. And so we find ourselves in a place that we don't want to be in. And this is what the Jewish people felt when they were having that conversation with Jesus. And Jesus is trying to help them to see that there is a much bigger story going on, and that He wants to provide for them in the midst of their story. It just might be different than what they are expecting. And so as I've been wrestling with this, and it's actually a story I've been wrestling with for quite a while now, is that as I think more about Jesus' words, and I think more about just in our own story, when our expectations and our realities do not align, and we just have this crisis of faith, and we're doubting God, and we're angry, and we're upset, and we're frustrated, that I believe that in these moments where things aren't as we would want them to be, that we really have two options. And I would just summarize it by saying this, is that you can either grumble or you can eat. That these are our two options in the midst of when our expectations and our realities don't align, and we find ourselves in a very difficult set of circumstances. Is we can grumble about it or we can eat. We're very good at grumbling, are we not? So often, things aren't going. I mean, we in many ways are very, very entitled because we're so used to having so much, and we're so used to having control that it's very easy for us to have either this subtle narrative or this very vocal narrative of grumbling, where all of a sudden we don't like our circumstances and we grumble about it. I believe that we're not supposed to grumble in the midst of our circumstances. Now, there's a difference, by the way, between grumbling and grieving. When circumstances are really difficult and really hard and really painful, I believe one of the best things we should do first, in addition to taking whatever that circumstance is to God, is to grieve, to lament, to name what is being lost, to name the pain and the heartache that is there. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about grieving as grumbling. I'm talking about grumbling from the perspective where Jesus wants to provide for us, wants to give us food in the midst of our circumstances, and we would rather grumble about what Jesus is offering or grumble about our circumstances rather than actually looking for a way to eat in the midst of our circumstances. Because in some cases, it's not just a question of grieving is something that we need to grieve. Sometimes it's just an issue of gratitude. Like our expectation is like really, really high about what we expect to have happen because we're entitled, and maybe, what we can do to eat in those circumstances is to not look at what we don't have, but to be grateful for the things that we do have and to actually look at things from another perspective. But in other cases, I believe that when we are going through these really hard, really painful situations, I truly believe that in the midst of those, Jesus is actually providing for us. That when He says here in John 6:35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. I believe that this is true regardless of our circumstances. That when we find ourselves in a place that we don't want to be in, I believe that we can still eat, that we can find the things that Jesus is doing to nourish us and sustain us in the midst of our circumstances. And what he wants us to do is to lean on him, to find the bread that he is giving to us, and to be able to eat in the midst of the environment that we find ourselves in. So friends, I don't know how this hits you where you're at in the midst of this Lenten season. I don't know if it's an issue for you of gratitude, or maybe it's just an issue of you of just going, I just need to eat in the midst of my circumstances. But I believe that Jesus is with us, that Jesus is walking with us in the midst of our story, that he wants to provide for us. And sometimes it's just providing for us just supernaturally. You know, you get a call out of the blue, you get something that you weren't expecting that's really good news. In other cases, Jesus works through our friends and our families to walk with us, to provide a meal, to just give us a word of encouragement. I think there's lots of ways that Jesus is providing for us in the midst of our circumstances. And I just want to encourage you to look for the bread. It may not be in abundance, but I believe it's going to be just enough. And that as we go through this season, and as we just really remind ourselves that Jesus is the bread of life, and we just constantly keep reminding ourselves this is who he is, never forget that in the season we celebrate that Jesus died and he rose again. That because he died on the cross for the sins of the world and he conquered death with the empty tomb, that Jesus gets the last say on everything. And that even if the circumstances we long for don't turn out the way that we hope for, Jesus gets the final say, that there is going to come a time when all is going to be made right, and Jesus is going to put on display the fact that he is the true King of Kings, Lord of Lords, by showing us how everything is being redeemed and restored, and all will be made right. And so I pray that in this season, that what you hope for and long for matches up with your reality. But where there is a gap, may you not grumble. Grieve where you need to grieve, but don't grumble, and go after the food that Jesus gives. Be open to what he is doing. And whether the circumstances turn out the way that you hope or not, just don't forget this is the season that we celebrate that Jesus conquered it all. And he is the true King of Kings, and he is the Lord of Lords. So friends, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. In the next episode, we're going to continue on in John 6, and I'm really excited. And then in our final episode, we're going to talk about the significance of bread in light of the resurrection. Cannot wait to celebrate the resurrection with you in that episode. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and may you walk out the text well in your life.